right, maggots. Drop and give me 50. Eyes front, attention. It's time to talk leadership styles. Episode 74, Two Chaps, Many Cultures. How does that make you feel inspired?
I'm not sure if I like that kind of approach. How do you talk to me? I almost felt like I'm back in the military and having to do all these weird things. Can I stand at ease now?
Yes, you may.
Captain Brett, Captain Parry.
Drill Sergeant, thank you very much.
So today, this is a good way to introduce this topic. I didn't expect that to happen. I'm a little caught off guard here.
I've got to surprise you sometimes. We can't
what
just
are we
have everything scripted. I've called our whole audience maggots. Not the best way to start off a Two Chaps episode 74, talking about leadership, talking about the styles of leadership, how they might be perceived, and how people might react to them, and are they appropriate? How does that set that up? And I'm sorry I called people maggots.
I'm really concerned for the well-being of our audience now. I hope you guys will recover from this. So what we will discover, though, is how do we recognize what way of leading or instructing or guiding or controlling, supervising of groups of people is the best one? What do you think is the best way to lead a group of people?
Well, it's cultural, as I've discovered in my.
Well, I think our audience has kind of gotten used to the fact that we're going to loop that in.
Yeah,
I'm curious for Brett Parry, growing up in Sydney, Australia. What is the leadership style you're used to? What is the one that was handed to you or embedded in you from the early days?
Well, in general, usually the people I looked up to, let me just say that the best ones that I responded to anyway. I had a very good leader in my very, very early career, and he was great. He was trusting. He was collaborative. He was interested. He was supportive. He was a coach, and as a result, I responded to it, and I found that a lot of people did respond to him positively in that way. And to this day, the people that work for him, are kind of this little club that we call, and I always remember that. It was had a big impact on my future professional life. So that was kind of, I would say, in general, the Australian style is kind of one of the mates, but when it comes down to brass tacks, we're willing to kind of let somebody take the lead, but only when we give it to them, if that makes sense, because we have kind of a tall poppy syndrome perception there, that if you actually come in and you think you've, just like I started this episode, you start coming in, you start shouting at people and you start talking down to them and you start putting yourself above them, that will kind of give you a little bit of a bit of a rough start.
Yeah, the word that resonated most with me was collaborative. So when you said one of the mates, so when we talk about being collaborative and part of a group, part of the mate, it sounds like you're part of equal peers. There's no discernible cascade of power, right? So everybody, at least at surface level, shares the same amount of influence and authority. Would that be safe to say?
Yep. You pull your pants on the same as me, and as far as I'm concerned, that's how we start the day. And then, that's basically how I think in general. Yeah.
how do you recognize that authority and power has been given to you by your peers? You said unless somebody is given that authority in your cultural context, how do you know that happened?
Well, I'll give you an example of a client of mine who was in the UK, had lived in Germany, Italy, and India, and had been a leader, very, very senior leader. And he had gone to Australia, and he had found that his historical purview of being a leader in those cultures, which was very hierarchical, where he was treated separate and above, and granted all this authority just by the fact of his sheer position and title, that went away in Australia. And that was what what formed the most of my coaching with him, was just basically going back to square one and saying, what he found is that he really liked it. He loved the point at which he was kind of now treated as one of the mates, but he was so uncomfortable in it because he hadn't had it, that he wasn't sure how to relate to it. And to your very question, he was not sure then, at what point do I now have to step up and be the leader in this group? That was the key point. And he when we discovered, we actually said, I said, there will be a point where they will kind of, the Aussies will start to come to you for sage advice. They will see you as the person who has the historical experience and the knowledge to do this. You've built the trust with them already. When they start to come with you and start to actually probably shut their mouth and say, now it's time for you to give us the lead, tell us where to point our arrows. And he had already had this experience, but he just didn't realize that it had happened. He was still trying to play the two roles. So there is a key point that happens, but you have to build that trust. You have to you have to bring yourself down. You have to be humble. You have to be collaborative, as I've said. You have to show that you're willing to listen. And then if you're willing to listen, then there'll be a point where the Aussies will say, okay, all right, time for you to pull the boots on and tell us where to go.
And I think this is a challenge for many people who come from a cultural background that values a clear pecking order, that a clear totem pole hierarchy, pyramid, whatever metaphor you want to use for distribution of power. For people who come from a society where as you're part of this group, as you're part of a society, it is inherently understood who has authority and who doesn't, and who can grant it to others, or how do you ascend, how do you earn more power and influence, more authority. If you're coming from one of those backgrounds and moving to a more egalitarian culture where it is less delineated who gets to do what and who calls the shots, that can be a real challenge. I've made that experience myself, right? So I come from a culture that is, let's say, a little bit more hierarchical than most Anglo-Saxon cultures. We're not as hierarchical as those cultures that are the poster children for hierarchical societies like Japan or Mexico, for example. But it was an adjustment period for me as well. And I mean, I'm as Brett and I have always made clear in the way we present this information, we want to be very conscious of when we talk about nationalities being a certain way. No Australian is alike, and no German, American, Japanese, Mexican, wherever you're from, is a stereotypical person from that country. There's always variances within those cultures in terms of behavior. However, we can distill certain leadership styles as prototypical. That's how we phrased it in show notes for this episode. And when we look at prototypes, let's look at the Aussie prototype here. We have an image prepared for you, just for you. Brett says here, and I'm going to take out that scrolling banner at the bottom, because it says here, being one of the mates. What does that mean? You're sitting around a table, it's a round table, and there's people symbolized by circles. However, I see the circles don't all have the same size. So does this illustrate what you just said?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
peers, but then there is some of us are bigger than others. How would you
Yeah,
describe that?
it is, yeah, and so this kind of would say in just a typical office setting that if you have your door open, people are going to see the door open, and they might be strolling by with their cup of tea and biscuit, and they might just pop in and say, "Hey, yeah, how you going? You know, like what's going on? Can we have a chat about?" And I thought about something else, and there's this kind of like really open relationship that you have with a boss, and maybe even the boss's boss. You know, you're able to, if your boss is absent, then you go to you see the next person up in the hierarchy, and you call into their office. And there's certainly people with bigger titles and responsibilities and commitments, but you know, pretty much everyone is accessible. And I would go back, you know, you talked about egalitarianism and status. I would also say that I've had many clients say that if they come across a boss, if they come from a hierarchical leadership style structure like they've been used to, and they are confronted by a boss who has an open door policy and invite and is rather friendly with them and congenial and this kind of thing, that also triggers their risk profile, right? If they because they might be more along the certainty, that hierarchy that they're used to gives them certainty. It knows who's who in the zoo, right? They know who to go to, who it's appropriate. And then when they're faced with somebody that says, you know, if I'm not here, just go to the next guy up, he'll help you too, and then they freeze because that's outside of their comfort zone.
Right. Now let's look at the comparison to Germany here, where it says here hierarchy plus consensus. So how I experience it, I'm going to move outside of that a little bit because I can still talk while looking at this. Isn't this awesome?
Hello.
So how I interpret it for myself is there's a clear chain of command. It's clear who is who in the zoo, who is the nominal head of the group. However, the nominal head is very unlikely to make decisions without having reached a broad consensus within the group. Even though my dot might be that little orange tiny dot on the bottom of this chain of command, my voice will still be heard, and I'm part of this team for a reason, because I have a certain skill set or expertise that makes me valuable to the group. So even though that yellow big ball on top may have the authority to overrule me, they would still listen to me and try to include me in the decision-making process. So consensus building is important. However, it's also clear that there is a tiebreaker or a final decision maker who's leading this group. So this is a leadership concept that requires a leader to be engaged and engaging with everybody on the team and solicit everybody's input and then weigh that accordingly and be basically the sorter of information. So how important is this piece? How important is that piece? Okay, let me put that together, make a nice puzzle, and present the final picture to the team and say, hey, is everybody on board with this? And if it's a, I don't know, 55 to 45, yay or nay, then that may not be enough for a German leader. They may seek to build a broader consensus. I would say, in my experience, rule of thumb is find a 2/3, 1/3 consensus base, at least, if not more, because then that would bring everybody, or as many people as I need as a leader to be risk comfortable enough to move forward with that decision. Now, as we compare this with leadership styles in the US, which I think are in a way fascinating, because I always thought that US leadership style is very egalitarian and yet also decisive. You see here, egalitarian, really? That looks like a little bit of a triangle. That looks a little bit like actually 3 pyramids inverted into each other, right? So you have a cascade of power and authority, and yet it's here structured individualism. I think this is a concept that took me a while to come to terms with as somebody from outside of the US, that there are individuals with their individual goals and decision-making powers. However, they will yield power to a nominal superior, nominal authority that is ranking higher than them. And to me, this was a learning curve that I'm still adjusting to be honest, after all these years, because my initial understanding of U.S. culture was, hey, we're all equal on paper, and we're a group of individuals who come together aligned along a common goal, and that deference to a higher power, to a higher authority, or for me as a German, the lack of consensus building that was necessary to lead efficiently in the US, that is sometimes hard for me to deal with. After all these years, I want to be part of a consensus and not be given instructions that I might not agree with.
Yeah, and I think some of that goes to the US style, speaks to the kind of the monochronic type of style of even the siloing and the focus on the job description. So the power yielding looks like power yielding, but it's basically saying, well, it's actually not my job anyway. Like, there is a person who is in a higher position that has this job, and if this is my monochronic thinking, that I don't want to, it's not that it doesn't leave room for creative thinking, but I don't want to step out of my bounds, step out of my lane, when there's somebody who is paid and given that power to do that. Whereas, so that's a good observation. I think that demonstrates it really well. And then you've got there is a lot of frustration from Western leaders in inverted commas, but they go to a country like Japan, very hierarchical, where the consent, but still a lot of consensus. Like trying to get everybody on board, the Nemawashi, right? They've got to meet everybody's needs. And
let me bring this up. This will illustrate it, and I will remove that scrolling banner on the bottom there. So hierarchy, yes. Consensus, also yes. So you look at where Japan is on this, right? So very hierarchical, also very consensual. And look where Germany is in that perspective. So you see Germany not quite as hierarchical, not quite as consensus driven, however, trending in the Japanese direction, so to say. Right. And compare that to the US or to Australia, much more egalitarian and also more top down, right? So the top down, I think, is what cultures in that lower right quadrant might struggle with.
Right. I think so. And again, just to get back to your valid point before, we're talking about countries here only because it's the construct in which we work, but every country has its leaders that display these traits. And so using, this might come even from their cultural heritage, how often do we come across somebody who has a German family heritage and they display very, very German styles, but then maybe not, so it is fluid. It's never absolute, but there is a starting point in all the work we do. The culture is a starting point to perhaps to begin to understand how, as a leader, you might want to approach an international assignment, moving to another country, or at least even if you're leading and taking ownership of the responsibility of operations in different countries, how you're going to manage leaders and how your message might be perceived as it goes down the ladder, right?
Yeah. Quite relevant. So I pulled up this image so people still see our face and see that graph. So just to, in full disclosure, the purple images that you saw earlier, those were from Richard D. Lewis's work, a British linguist who looks at national culture comparisons through the lens of language. The diagram we're displaying here is from Erin Meyer's book, The Culture Map, where she overlays cultural dimensions in a more complex yet more, I think, more nuanced way. So we're not just comparing status versus egalitarianism, we're also comparing consensus versus top-down. And the nation cultures are plotted along that grid, as you can see. And again, careful how much absoluteness you want to ascribe to the concept of nation culture. Be mindful that there's variance in this. But you can see groups, right? You can see the egalitarian consensual quadrant, which is home to a lot of the European, Nordic, Scandinavian cultures. You can see the top-down egalitarian quadrant that is home to a lot of the Anglo-Saxon cultures. You see the hierarchical top-down more in Asia, South America, and I would also say sub-Saharan, Africa in general, Middle East would fall into that corner mostly. And then I think the quadrant with hierarchical and consensual, that is probably the least inhabited one of these quadrants. And I personally don't have experience with cultures outside of the three ones that you see pictured here that would fall into that area. Maybe Korea, to a certain degree, might fall into that pocket as well. I'm not so sure about that, though. So I think these visualizations help us at least approximate these abstract concepts a little bit. I don't think any of these models claim to be the absolute truth of this. A model that I like to use often when we talk about leadership prototypes is the comparison model of two team sports. I know Brett has another one that he'll share in a second. Mine compares football, American football, with the other football that's actually played with a ball and the feet. So soccer in the United States. So this is comparing two prototypes, and you're also seeing two players that are well known in their respective field, and they both have the number 25 on their shirts. And yet, even though the name of the game seems so similar, it's the pitch on which they play seems similar, and it's not the same. So those of you who've spent time with me in cultural training programs around leadership across cultures will recognize this model. I'm not going to debrief it here completely, but rest assured that one is a more a leadership approach in which leaders ascribe autonomy in decision making to individual team members, and the other prototype is a clear standard operating procedure, prescriptive type of leadership, which is definitely not the same, even though both team activities are called football and are played on a rectangular pitch. They're not the same, and we use that as an explainer metaphor in the workshops that I lead. So what's your model, Brett? What sports are you using to describe it?
Well, I just use the same sport, and it is the difference internally in the game of cricket. And when I first thought of this, I thought, well, it's a bit bold of me to prescribe a difference in leadership styles in a country that I've never lived in, but I know the sport deeply. So my observation of two different captaincy styles in the Indian cricket team, that a few years back, a gentleman by the name of MS Dhoni, a Southern Indian, very kind of low key, highly accomplished, and very good at his craft. But he was the leader, and the Indian team did well. They were quite good, very accomplished, had great success. He certainly had personal success. Cricket in and of itself is a pretty egalitarian sport. You have a captain, but he really doesn't. He's not the figurehead like the quarterback in an NFL team. But then after him came a gentleman by the name of Virat Kohli, who was from New Delhi. Now, it might be said that gives an indication of a little bit more directness. And in the sport itself, it displays itself as aggressiveness. So as us Aussies, who are quite proud of the way we play cricket, all of a sudden we're confronted with a leader who was very aggressive back at us. And of course, it influenced the rest of the team. It had an effect on how the whole team played the game. And all of a sudden we were getting kicked in the shins pretty hard by these guys, and they beat us handily on a number of occasions where we had to wake up and say, well, we're now playing against a different Indian team. It's the same country, it's the same team, but it's a different leader. And their influence has had his influence has had a profound effect on the way the team plays the game. And so that's just one example. And when I've used that as a metaphor with even many, many Indian clients, they go, that's exactly right. And of course they're quite proud of Virat. They love MS Dhoni as well, but they love Virat as well. But it is the recognition of how a leader can impact the I even bring it down to sometimes I'll walk into a Starbucks if I'm, I frequent Starbucks for their cups of tea, not their coffee, but I'll often walk in and I'll watch I'm observant of the interaction between the people behind the counter, strangely enough, and I'm watching how friendly they are to the customers, and I'm cognizant of this, having a retail background, and how this might be influenced by the leader or the owner of that particular franchise. And quite often or not, if I get the chance to meet that owner or franchise manager, I find that what the person is behind the power is what displays behind the counter. It's happened so many times I could probably write a book on it, but it is just it really does bring to bear how just that influence can be perceived by the clients of a business. This is how impactful it is for the business, that you should be cognizant of how your style is influencing the way your staff and the people around you present your business to the world.
Right. Which brings to the awareness that what we talked about so far, cultural comparisons are fine and dandy in describing leadership style preferences. However, we want to make sure that we also look at the personality type. You may find a Japanese leader who is quite assertive and top down and defying what we just told you about the Nemawashi consensus that permeates Japanese business culture, because that Japanese leader may have done most of his work or her work outside of Japan in maybe North America. Maybe they worked for Toyota of America and they learned to be a little bit more decisive. Who knows? You might encounter a German leader who is I don't know, much more egalitarian and doesn't care about her academic degrees and her official rank and file within the organization, and she'll be one of the mates around the table. So personality informed that as well. So we want to make sure that we don't reduce this to national stereotypes. Now, It takes an observing eye. It takes a culturally savvy individual to recognize which leadership style will work best with your team. And I've had this so many times with our clients that when we talk about all these prototypes and these models, they come to the conclusion for themselves that they need to be able to flexibly morph into different leadership models depending on who in their organization they're dealing with. They might become a much more football quarterback type leader with a certain part of their workforce and become more of a center back soccer player with another portion of their team. And they need to have the agility and flexibility to adjust to whatever is thrown at them. So there is not one size that fits all, right? And having that ability is critical.
Yep, absolutely. Be willing to wear 2 pairs of shoes. That's fun too.
Yeah,
that'll make you stand out. And socks that don't match. That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why not?
But, by the way, I want to bring the full disclosure home here. Since I mentioned the books, right? So this is Richard Lewis. So if you ever come across him, lots of thick stuff here. Find it. You may not agree with everything because I don't, but some of that stuff is really good. And the one is Eric Meyer's The Culture Map. So go study, read up. And if you already read it, or if you don't want to read it, just call Brett. Just call me. We're here. We do this for a living.
We'll read it to you over the phone, audiobook style.
Well, I'll text it to you. I'll send you text messages.
You'll text
Chapter by chapter.
You'll text the whole chapter. There's a promise for you.
I'm totally being sidetracked here, but I know this guy on LinkedIn who creates Instagram accounts where he basically digests whole books in Instagram meme style. So he has like, I don't know, 200 posts on one Instagram account, which is the digest of one book that he likes. Interesting concept. We're not doing that. However, Brett and I, we do this for a living. So if the leadership questions are painful to you, and if you've run into issues there, you know how to find us. Or if you don't, look at the banner. That's where you find us.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, that's another one of the Can 74, Two Chaps, Many Cultures, for a Thursday or any day, depending on what day you're listening to us. Please give us your feedback, questions, comments, answers, structured arguments, abstracts, whatever. Pretty pictures, paint pictures, send us anything. Really, we'll take it all.
Don't send us your homework. We're not grading that.
No, we're not doing your homework for you. That's for sure. Yeah. All right.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Now, give me 50. All right.